Okay, so that's a general overview of what stress is, the different types of stress, how you can break it down, etc. So now let's talk about the biological correlates. Where does it happen in the brain? Okay, so again, we're gonna bring back some stuff we've already talked about, which is kind of cool. So one of the key players in this in the brain is your amygdala. Your amygdala is helping to identify dangerous stimuli. It's kind of the key player of what we call the fear circuit. So let's review. Do you remember again, back from neuroscience, we talked about Amy the almond because your amygdala is the size and shape kind of an almond. So Amy the almond is really good at saying, hey, that's a snake. You should feel fear or you should feel stress for that snake. So this is something we talked about earlier on. And again, it's going to come back here. So let's break down this cycle. And these are all things we've kind of talked about throughout this course. So we see a stimulus. So this, for instance, I'm using the visual example of a snake here. So what happens when we see that snake? Well, first, or the main kind of first spot it goes in our visual pathway. If you kind of remember from sensation and perception, you know that visual stimulus is going to go through our eyeball, it's going to be projected towards the back of the brain, but on the way to the back of the brain, we're going to pass through the thalamus. If you remember, the thalamus is that relay station from the environment to the cortex. So what it does is it brings the stimulus from the environment to the cortex, right? And we talked about how after in your visual pathway, it passes through the thalamus and it goes to the occipital lobe, where it starts to be processed into visual objects and visual stimuli. And that kind of occurs in higher level ways as you move towards the front of your brain. So in the temporal lobe, we might do things like categorize that object. And we might say, okay, that object is an animal or a person or a scene, etc. So your temporal lobe of your cortex is saying, okay, that I've identified is a snake. This whole process is kind of what we talked about in sensation and perception, how we sense a stimulus from our eyes and it gets all the way perceived into our cortex. So cool review of sensation and perception. But from there, how do we attach emotion? Well, the cortex communicates with your amygdala. Your amygdala and your cortex talk a lot, so they're highly connected both structurally and functionally. Because your cortex is going to say, hey, amygdala, Amy the almond, I have seen a snake. A snake is what I've identified, so what should I do? And Amy the almond is able to say, okay, it's going to assess that stimulus and determine whether or not it's a fearful stimulus or not. And if it is, it's going to then trigger the hypothalamus to take care of it. So if you remember back, the hypothalamus, the thing that is below the thalamus, this kind of yellow region right here, is in charge of releasing a bunch of hormones. And it does that through these two pituitary glands right below it. So it is able to initiate this fight or flight response because it can release certain hormones, which we're going to talk about a little later, into your bloodstream to get your muscles to do a thing or your heart to do a thing, etc., and get your body to physically respond to that snake that you originally saw. So it's kind of this cool pathway that covers, we've seen each of these different stages in isolation, but it's cool to see them all together, right? And there's two ways. I mean, I kind of just ended it here with a little like star. There are two ways that this fight or flight response might actually happen. So let's break that part down a little bit more. So that fight or flight response can be produced through two different pathways. The first pathway, before we go into pathways, I'm gonna remind you of a few more things because then it'll make a lot more sense. So again, a brief review of neuroscience. When we talked about the hypothalamus, which is that brain structure that's kind of like a doctor, just keeping everything regulated and normal, keeping homeostasis in your body. We talked about how the hypothalamus is also a player in the endocrine system. So not just the neural system, which is all of your brain and spinal cord, but the endocrine system, which is involved in releasing hormones into your bloodstream and actually getting, these fight or flight kind of responses to occur. We talked about briefly how the hypothalamus regulates that pituitary gland, which we just saw in that image before this. It tells the pituitary gland to release different hormones depending on what the need is of that particular stimulus. And those hormones can then control things. They control things like your metabolism, how aroused your body is. So whether you're in fight or flight or rest or digest mode. It controls things like growth, sex hormones, things like that are all taken care of by this endocrine system. So keep this in mind. The other thing I want to remind you of that we talked about in neuroscience is the brainstem. Specifically, we talked about this lower yellow section called the medulla. So if you remember back to neuro, we have the medulla, we have the pons, which we talked a lot about in like the sleep-wake cycles of consciousness. And we have this green midbrain right here that connects all the way up to the thalamus. So these are all parts we've seen before. But this yellow region, we talked about being essential for different life functions because it's connected to the spinal cord, which gives directions to your body. And we talked about how it's important for things like heart rate or breathing. So that's where this comes in again, because now in this fight or flight response of stress, we're needing to control things like heart rate or breathing. So medulla is also a key player in this process. In addition to these two things, though, there are a couple things that I want to, a couple more players that I want to introduce you to. And that is one, pointing out in specific, this pituitary gland, so this tiny little like P-shaped little blob that's right below your hypothalamus. And then lastly, your adrenal glands. So this is these kind of things, these two parts right here. I don't actually know if it's just the white or the red. You don't have to know that. I'm not a bio person, but it's these parts down here. So these are the key players that we're going to talk about with these two pathways. So let's put it together. There are two ways that the fight or flight response might be produced. The first is what we call the sympathetic, like the sympathetic nervous system, adrenal, like the adrenal glands, medullary, like the medulla system. So this is SAM, the SAM system. And what the SAM system does is it initiates the release of hormones called epinephrine or norepinephrine, which are kind of your just adrenaline rush kind of hormones. So what this initiates is this response that's really immediate. If you think of like the adrenaline of going on a roller coaster, for instance, you're kind of like pounding heart, your rapid breathing, that quick kind of response, but it's also pretty short-lived. So once you're done with the roller coaster or whatever, like it's dissipated. So the things to know about the SAM system is it involves adrenaline, or the other fancy name of epinephrine and norepinephrine, and it's short. So SAM, S for SAM, S for short. So in contrast to that, we have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis or system made up of the hypothalamus, which we've seen before, which signals to the pituitary gland, which releases the hormones, and also talks to the adrenal glands too. And this creates the HPA axis or system. I don't know why it's called an axis, to be honest. But what this system does, the hormone that it releases is called cortisol, which you may have kind of heard is like your typical stress hormone. So it increases the energy that's available to deal with that stress. It leads to a longer lasting response than this kind of short-lived immediate SAM response. And what it kind of does, if you have a lot of long-term stress, it causes that cortisol to remain in your body for a longer period of time. So if your body's just constantly in this stressed out state, it's going to produce a number of harmful effects. If you have long-term like cortisol exposure, it might lead to different neurons dying off, for instance. But the last thing in here, I found I didn't know this. This whole process is actually regulated by the hippocampus. If you remember, the hippocampus is your memory region, right? We talked a lot about this in the memory chapter. The hippocampus actually contains a lot of receptors for cortisol, and it acts in this kind of feedback loop that controls the activity of this system, the HPA system. So whenever the hippocampus detects high levels of cortisol, it knows that too much cortisol is bad, too high of cortisol can lead to long-term deficits. So it then signals to the hypothalamus to shut it off. So hypothalamus then passes the message to the pituitary gland, which passes the message to the adrenal glands, and they're like, cool, stop releasing cortisol. So it's kind of this feedback loop. Yeah, so it's kind of a cool way that you see all these different brain regions that are working together to get this stress response to occur. So I think the main things that I would keep in mind to differentiate these are knowing what the hormone is that occurs, and how long the response lasts. So whether it's short or whether it's long. So these are the two ways that fight or flight responses can be produced.